The Luna of the most powerful pack in the northern reaches walked away from her own newborn twins, left them in a blizzard beneath a crumbling stone arch without a second glance. Not stolen, not lost, abandoned. She called them weak. She called them a liability. And she stepped into her carriage and disappeared into the frozen dark as though they had never existed at all. The only one who stayed, the only one who ran toward those fading cries instead of away from them, was an Omega girl with no rank, no title, and nothing to gain. She held 2 dying heirs against her chest through the longest night of her life. And somehow, that single act of defiance set in motion something no one in the kingdom could have predicted. Why would the Alpha King, a man who bowed to nothing and no one, kneel before an Omega? What did he see in her that changed everything? Watch until the end. This is one story you will not want to stop halfway through. The blizzard came the way all catastrophic things come to the northern reaches, without warning and without mercy. By the time the sun had drowned behind the iron-gray horizon, the wind had become a living thing, clawing at the stone battlements of Ironvale's stronghold with the patience of something that knew it would eventually win. Iron Zolvike pulled her wool cloak tighter and ducked her head against the gust, her lantern swinging wildly in her grip as she made her final circuit of the estate's outer yards. She was the last one out. She always was. It was the nature of being an Omega at the bottom of a great pack's hierarchy. You were the first to arrive and the last to leave, and in between you tried very hard not to be noticed. At 22 winters, Erin had perfected the art of existing in the margins. She knew which floorboards in the Great Hall creaked, which beta guards preferred their evening rounds left undisturbed, and exactly how to lower her gaze when the Alpha's War Council swept past her in the corridors. She was not weak. Any creature who survived the brutal winters of the northern reaches could not be called weak. But she was quiet, and quiet in Ironvale was its own form of armor. She was passing the stone archway of the old eastern gatehouse when she heard it. A sound so thin, so desperately small against the howling of the wind, that she almost missed it entirely. She stopped walking, held her breath. The lantern flame guttered. There. Not a bird. Not the wind finding a crack in the mortar. Something alive. Something fading. Erin's boots punched through the crust of snow as she moved toward the sound, her healer's instincts pulling her forward before her mind had fully caught up. The eastern archway was a half-ruin, rarely used, tucked behind the wood store. Not a place anyone with good intentions would choose on a night like this. She found them beneath the overhang of a crumbling buttress. 2 bundles, small enough to fit in the hollow of her arms together, wrapped in fine linen that was now soaked through, the embroidered trim of Ironvale's royal crest dissolving into mud at the edges. Inside the wrappings, so still, so cold, were 2 newborn infants. Their lips had gone the color of a winter sky just before dark. Their tiny chests barely moved. The Alpha King's heirs. She recognized the royal seal. Everyone in Ironvale knew that the Luna had delivered twin pups 6 days past. Erin's hands were already moving, checking pulses, pressing her palm to each small forehead, calculating temperature against the wind chill and the hour. The part of her mind trained in the healer's craft was already problem-solving. The rest of her mind was catching up to the horror. "What are you doing?" The voice came from behind her, and it was not startled. It was composed in the way of someone who had already decided nothing here would touch them. Iron turned. She had seen Sigrid of Ironvale at a distance before. Everyone had. The Luna was the kind of beautiful that made the eye want to linger and the instinct want to retreat. Tall, sharp-boned, with dark hair coiled at her nape, and a traveling cloak of black wolf, fur that shed the snow like water. She stood beside a waiting horse sled, her posture unhurried. 2 of her personal guards flanked her at a careful remove. "My lady." Erin's voice came out steadier than she felt. "The pups. They are." "I know what they are." Sigrid's tone was the temperature of the stone beneath the snow. "Leave them." The words arrived in Aaron's ears and then took a moment longer to arrange themselves into meaning. "They'll die," Aaron said. Not as accusation, as simple fact. They were born too small. Sigrid pulled her gloves smooth, finger by finger, her attention already drifting toward the waiting sled. An alpha king cannot have heirs who enter the world gasping like fish. I will not present weakness to the council. I will not spend my years nursing runts. She glanced back once, and her eyes, pale and utterly level, found Aaron's with something like amusement. "You're the healer's apprentice, aren't you? The Omega girl who sews up the hounds and sets bones for stable hands." Aaron said nothing. "Then here is your purpose," Sigrid said, something like kindness threading through the cruelty of it, which somehow made it worse. "If you want them to live, keep them. They are no longer mine. They are no longer the king's concern. You will say nothing of what you saw tonight, or I will have your tongue removed before the week is out." She stepped into the sled. The guards fell in behind her. The horse lurched forward through the snow. Aaron watched the lantern light at the sled's rear grow smaller until it was indistinguishable from any other star in the dark. Then she looked down at the two small bodies in her arms, and the decision that made itself, "You are coming with me, both of you, right now," was so immediate and total that it didn't feel like courage at all. It felt like gravity. The servants' wing of Ironvale was buried in the foundation of the North Tower. Thick stone walls, low ceilings, persistent smell of tallow and dried herbs. In summer, it was tolerable. In winter, the cold seeped through the mortar and pooled in the corners despite the small iron stove that Aaron kept fed through the night. She kicked the door open with her knee and laid the twins on her narrow sleeping cot with hands that had stopped shaking through sheer will alone. "Breathe," she told herself, which was also what she told the boy pup, whose chest had gone almost entirely still during the sprint across the yard. "Breathe." She worked the way she had been taught, methodically, without panic, because panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She stripped the soaked linen from both pups and wrapped them together in her own sleeping blanket, the one she had treated with pressed oils of chamomile and pine resin to keep the cold from her own bones. Then she stoked the stove past its usual night measure and positioned the cot close enough to feel the radiant heat as a physical pressure. The girl pup, Sulka, she would name her in her mind, needing something to hold on to, was the stronger of the two. Her skin had begun its slow crawl back from blue toward something closer to living pink within the first quarter hour. She fussed. She wailed. The wailing was the most beautiful sound Aaron had ever heard. The boy was harder. "Leaf," she decided. "You are Leaf. You have your father's stubbornness, I'm sure of it. Use it." She worked by touch and instinct, her palms moving in slow, careful circles against his back and chest. The technique old healer Marta had shown her for reviving cold-shocked pups and early-born lambs, which were, in the end, not entirely different problems. She mixed goat's milk with barley water and a measure of honey, warming it to body temperature against the stovetop, and used a length of linen rolled to a narrow tip to coax drops into each small mouth in turn. The hours ran together. Outside, the blizzard threw itself against the stone walls of the North Tower, with a sound like the world rehearsing the end of itself. Inside, the stove-light painted everything amber and copper, and Aaron sat hunched on the edge of the cot with both infants tucked against the warm skin of her chest, her cloak wrapped around all three of them. She hummed, because sound was warmth too, an old song her mother had sung in the days before Aaron had been given to Ironvale's service, a melody that moved in circles and never fully resolved, like the sea. Around the third hour past midnight, Leaf's eyes opened. They were golden, a deep, luminous amber, the unmistakable color of alpha bloodlines. He stared up at her with the unfocused, absolute attention of a newborn, encountering the world for the first time, and Aaron felt something shift in her chest, something that had no name yet, but that she recognized the shape of. Oh, she thought, I'm in trouble. She pressed a careful kiss to his forehead and reached to check Sulka's breathing in the same moment, and that was how she spent the rest of the night. Caught between the two of them, equal in her exhaustion and her devotion, unaware that 3 floors above her, the eastern gates had just burst open beneath the hooves of a returning war company, and that its leader had already begun to smell, through the wind and the stone, through the wind and the stone, through the wind and the stone. The first thing Valderick Ashenmore did when he crossed the threshold of Ironvale, after 12 days at the contested southern border, was remove his war helm and breathe. He catalogued, as he always did, the smell of wood smoke, tallow, wet stone, the pack's collective scent layered into the walls like old mortar. His beta Bram had dismounted beside him, already barking orders at the stable hands, already reading the yard's atmosphere the way experienced warriors read silence before an ambush. Something's wrong, Bram said, not a question. The nursery, Valderick said. He was already moving. What he found there erased 12 days of exhaustion and replaced them with something colder and far more dangerous than fatigue. The royal nursery was empty. The cradles were cold, not recently vacated, but hours cold. The night nurse was gone. The outer door had been latched from inside, which meant someone had used the servants' passage. The faint trace of Sigrid's scent lay over everything like a film of ice, and beneath it, so faint he had to drop to his knees on the stone floor and press his nostrils almost to the ground, was the ghost of something that made his wolf go absolutely silent. His pups, moving away, moving down. The roar that built in his chest never fully left it. He contained it. Barely. He had learned a long time ago that rage was a weapon best kept sheathed until you knew exactly where to swing. Find them, he said to Bram. His voice was quiet. Quiet in the way a fire is quiet, before it catches on something that cannot be unburned. Trace every passage from this room. Now. The knock on Aaron's door came before dawn. Not the tentative knock of a servant, or the polite rap of a guard on routine rounds. This was a knock that communicated without any ambiguity that whoever stood on the other side would come through the door whether it was open for them or not. Aaron set Sulka down with exquisite care. Both pups were sleeping now, their breathing steady, their color restored to something that could be called healthy, and crossed the small room. She took one breath, opened the door. The man on the other side of it was large in the way that mountain ridges are large, not just in dimension but in presence, in the way the air around him seemed to reorganize itself. She had seen the Alpha King before, at distance, in processions and councils, the way one sees something impressive through a window and feels grateful for the glass between them. This was not that. This was him, close enough that she could see the frost still caught in the dark wool of his cloak, the line of tension running from his jaw to his shoulders, and the eyes, storm-gray iron-edged, scanning the room past her before she had a chance to speak. Those eyes found the cot, found his children, and something happened in his face that Erin would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to herself in accurate terms, and would keep failing. It wasn't softness exactly, it was the opposite of armor, which is different from softness. A door falling open in a wall that had no visible hinges. He moved past her. She stepped aside because there was no reasonable alternative. He crossed to the cot in 3 strides and stopped, his hands hovering above the sleeping pups for a long moment before he touched them. His fingertips barely grazing Life's cheek, then Sulka's. Checking temperature, checking pulse, the way someone does who knows what cold death looks like and is confirming it is not present. "They're stable," Aaron said from the doorway. Her voice came out at an appropriate volume which surprised her. "The boy was worse when I found them. Around the 2nd hour he turned the corner. The girl recovered faster." Valderick straightened. He turned to look at her, and this time the weight of it was full. Not the distracted scan of a moment ago, but actual attention, directed, consuming. She understood in that moment why every wolf in 5 territories moved carefully around this man. Not because of the physical scale of him, though that was undeniable. Because of the quality of his focus. He looked at things as though he intended to understand them completely, and that was its own form of pressure. "You found them," he said. "In the eastern archway, beneath the old buttress. They'd been there, my estimate is 2 hours, perhaps more." Silence. "The Luna," he said. Not a question. Erin said nothing. She had made her decision on that matter already. She would not be the instrument of whatever political devastation came next. She held his gaze and stayed quiet. His jaw moved. He looked back at his pups. Then back at her. "You're the apprentice," he said. "Marta's girl." "Marta died last autumn. I hold the healer's post now." She paused. Informally. Something crossed his face. Not quite surprise. More like recalibration. The man was rearranging information she had just given him, and she could almost see it happening. "What is your name?" "Aaron Zolvai." Aaron. He said it as though testing whether it held weight. Apparently it did. "You saved my children's lives tonight, Aaron." "I did what anyone would have," she began. "No," he said, and the single word was so absolutely certain that it closed the argument before it could become one. "They would not have." She looked at the floor, then back up because she refused to be the kind of person who looked at the floor when things became uncomfortable. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Valdrick said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and far more complicated, "you tell me everything you saw, and then we determine what comes next." What came next, Valdrick determined, was this. Erin would remain at Iron Vale as the pup's primary keeper. She would be moved from the servants' wing to a room adjacent to the nursery. She would be given full access to the healer's stores and a modest stipend from the household accounts. She would tell no one what she had witnessed in the eastern archway. He announced this the following morning, standing at the head of the hall's breakfast table with his beta and 2 senior elders as witness, in the flat tone of a man reciting the terms of a military commission. Aaron said, "No." The hall went very quiet. Bram made a sound like a man who has just watched someone step confidently onto ice of unknown thickness. Valdrick looked at her across the length of the table with an expression she could not read at all. "No," he repeated. "I am a healer," Erin said. Her pulse was conducting itself at a speed she found medically alarming, but her voice mercifully was calm. "If I give up my healer's role to become a nursemaid, I lose what makes me useful to this pack." And eventually, she met his gaze directly, which she had been doing less carefully since the previous night, and which she would need to stop doing if she wanted to retain her ability to think clearly. "Eventually the pups won't need a keeper. They'll need a healer. I would rather be the person who is both." She paused. "I will take the room adjacent to the nursery. I will see to their care and their health, but I will continue my healer's duties alongside it, not in place of them." Another silence. Longer. "You negotiate," Valdrick said, as though this were a quality he was cataloging. "I clarify," Aaron said. Elder Thyra, at the far end of the table, made a small sound that might have been a laugh, suppressed immediately behind a fist. Bram looked as though he was reconsidering his general position on Omegas. Valdrick studied her for a moment that felt geological in length. Then he inclined his head, once, in a gesture that was clearly not something he did very often. "Clarified," he said. "Accepted." 3 weeks into the new arrangement, Erin was returning from the lower stores with a basket of dried yarrow and willow bark when she nearly walked directly into the Alpha King in the corridor outside the training hall. She stepped back. He stopped. Between them, a proximity neither had chosen and neither, for a moment, corrected. He had come from practice. She could tell from the state of him. The damp at his collar where sweat had dried in the cold, the unwound wrapping on his left forearm. And the wrapping, she noted, was doing rather a poor job of concealing a gash that ran from his wrist to a point several inches above it. Fresh, edged with the particular darkness that indicated a blade rather than a training accident. This was not from sparring. "That needs attention," she said before he could speak. He looked at his arm as though he had briefly forgotten it existed. "It's healing. It's infected." He looked at her. "The edge is the wrong color. Come to the healer's room." She was already turning. The invitation was issued in the tone of a person who expected it to be followed, which she had not entirely intended, but which seemed, to her own surprise, to work. The healer's room was small, stone-floored, smelling of dried plants and beeswax, the morning light coming through a single high window in a long flat beam. Irene set her basket down and indicated the low stool beside the work table. Valdric folded himself onto it with the particular careful movements of a very large man in a very small space, which for reasons she declined to examine made her want to smile. She unwound the old wrapping. The gash was 3 inches long, clean at the edges, but yes, the skin around it had gone a shade too warm. "Hold still," she said, and reached for the bowl of cooled yarrow solution. He held still. She worked efficiently, cleaning the wound with cloths she changed twice, applying a paste of powdered willow bark mixed with beeswax. Her hands moved without trembling, which was a professional achievement, because there was something deeply disorienting about the juxtaposition of scale, his forearm resting across her lap, a thing the size of a small branch of oak, and her hands on it, narrow-fingered and careful. She was aware of the warmth of his skin in a way that was medically irrelevant and personally inconvenient. "You were at the southern border again," she said, because silence between them had a texture she was trying to manage. 3 days, he said. "Brief negotiation." "That doesn't look like a negotiation wound." A pause. It was a negotiation that required clarification. His tone carried something, not quite humor, but adjacent to it. She glanced up involuntarily. He was looking at her with a slight quality of attention she had not seen directed her way before, a private and contained version of it, and she looked back down at his arm immediately. She reached for the new linen wrapping and began to wind it. Her thumb, steadying the cloth against his wrist, pressed briefly against the inside of his pulse point, and she felt his heartbeat, steady, slower than most men's even at rest, the controlled rhythm of a body that had been trained to extraordinary discipline. She wondered if he felt her pulse too. He probably did. His senses were an alpha's senses. She kept her face neutral and tied off the wrapping. "It needs to be changed tomorrow," she said, stepping back, restoring the appropriate distance. "Come before morning council." He stood, unfolded to his full height. The room felt briefly like it had shrunk. He looked at the wrapped forearm for a moment, then at her. "Marta was good," he said, which was not, she thought, a comment about Marta. He left. Irene sat down on the stool he had just vacated, because her legs had decided, now that he was gone, to register their objection to the last several minutes. Outside the high window, the winter light moved across the stone floor in a slow, bright bar. She listened to the sound of her own breathing and told herself firmly that whatever that was, it was not useful. It happened again the next morning, and the morning after that, until the wound was closed. Each time was quieter than the time before. Each time, the silence between them felt less like absence and more like something being carefully built. The midwinter feast was Ironvale's largest gathering. 2 days of ceremonies, competitions, and feasting that drew every high-ranking member of the northern reaches' allied packs under one roof. Irene had attended before, as a servant, invisible in the way all servants are invisible at events designed for the powerful. This year, Valdric had given direct word through Bram that she was to sit at the high table in the household families section, as the Pups' official keeper. She wore the dress her friend Runa had helped her alter. Deep green wool, fitted at the waist, the sleeves lined with fox fur dyed amber. Runa braided her hair back from her face with a cord of twisted silver thread. Looking in the polished brass of the preparation room, Erin didn't entirely recognize herself, and wasn't sure how she felt about that. "You look," Runa said carefully, "like someone the king is going to have trouble not looking at." "Don't," Erin said. Runa grinned. "I'm just observing." The feast hall was warm with bodies and firelight, loud with music and the controlled chaos of several hundred wolves who had been given permission to relax. Erin found her place at the high table and settled into it, keeping her posture easy, her expression courteous. Leif and Solka were with the night keeper. She had settled them herself before coming down, and she would not relax fully until she was back beside them, but they were safe. Valdric arrived late, as the first courses were being served, and the hall quieted in that reflexive way it always did when he entered. Not fear exactly, but the involuntary recognition of something that outranked everything else in the room. He moved to the high table, exchanged words with his senior Bettis, and took his seat. 3 seats from hers. She became aware, as the evening progressed, of a gradual and undeniable fact. His gaze returned to her. Not constantly, not obviously, but in the way that a fire, if you watch it long enough, reveals its patterns. There was a frequency to it, a rhythm, and each time she felt it she found something deeply interesting to examine about her wine cup, or the rafters, or the musicians across the hall. Halfway through the second course, a visiting gamma, young, broad, with the easy confidence of a man who had rarely been told no, appeared at her elbow and asked if he might have her company for the evening's dancing. She was considering a polite refusal when she became aware that the particular quality of the hall's ambient noise had shifted slightly, and that across 3 seats of table, a pair of storm-gray eyes had gone very still. She told the gamma she appreciated the invitation, but was retiring early for the Pups' night feeding. He accepted this gracefully. She did not look at Valdric directly. But later, much later, as the feast reached its peak and the hall roared with warmth and music, she looked up from her cup to find him watching her, and for a single moment neither of them arranged their expressions in time, and what passed between them was the wordless acknowledgement of something neither was ready to name. Elder Thyra, seated at the far end of the table, watched this exchange with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting for it. The second great blizzard of that winter arrived 12 days after the feast, and it arrived without the polite warning of building clouds. It simply fell, all at once, a white curtain drawn across the world between the 7th and 8th hours of the evening. Erin had already been in the nursery for an hour, when she realized the storm had sealed the corridors with drafts cold enough to be genuinely dangerous. She stoked the nursery hearth to capacity and resigned herself to the night. Valdric appeared in the doorway around the 9th hour. He had clearly been in the corridors. His hair was damp with melted snow, his cloak still shedding it. He looked at the room, at the Pups sleeping in their cradles, at Erin sitting cross-legged on the floor, beside the hearth with a book across her knee. "The East Wing passage is shut by snowdrift," he said. "The servants' access route too." She looked up, looked at him, understood what this meant. "There's a chair," she said, gesturing. He looked at the chair, a modest wooden thing that had originally been intended for a wet nurse and was visibly inadequate for his proportions. Something moved across his face. He brought the chair to the hearth, turned it backward, and sat with his arms folded across the back of it, which was the only configuration that made any physical sense. The fire between them crackled. Outside, the storm pressed its white weight against the thick glass of the nursery window. "What are you reading?" he asked after a while. She held it up so he could see the spine. The Wanderer of the Ice Roads, an old traveler's account of the far north, half mythology and half practical geography. Old Marta left it. She said the navigation sections were useful for calculating herb ranges by latitude. Do they work? Reasonably. The mythology sections are better. He leaned slightly forward to look at the page she was on. His proximity in the warmth of the room was, she chose not to finish that sentence, even in her own mind. There are stories in there about mega wolves, he said. The old kind? The ones the sagas call Vitamar, Whiteheart wolves. They were considered. He stopped. Sacred, she finished, because she knew the word. The packs that remembered said they were the ones who held the healing web together, that the pack's health ran through them. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Ram told me after the first night that he'd tracked your path across the yard. You moved from the east gate to the north tower in a blizzard with 2 infants in your arms. He said he couldn't understand how you'd done it. Iran looked at the fire. I didn't think about it. I thought about getting them warm. That, Valdrick said slowly, is exactly what makes it extraordinary. She looked at him. He was looking at her, and this time there was no quick rearrangement of expression, no retreat into the formal distance he usually maintained. He was simply looking, openly, the way she imagined he looked at things he had decided to understand completely. Her pulse did something that she chose, with great effort, to ignore. Tell me about the mythology sections, he said. So she did. She read to him from the old traveler's account while the storm threw itself against the glass, her voice low so as not to wake the pups, and he listened with his chin resting on his crossed arms, his eyes half closed in the fire's warmth, and she was acutely aware of the exact quality of the silence he was offering her. Not distraction, not tolerance. Genuine, complete attention. Leaf stirred around the 11th hour and began to fuss. Iron rose and went to him, lifting him with the practiced ease of 3 weeks' daily handling. She rocked him, murmuring, until he subsided. When she looked up, Valdrick was watching. May I, he said, and it was not exactly a question, but it was more uncertain than anything she had heard from him before. She brought Leaf to him. Watched the careful, barely revealing process by which the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches received his sleeping infant son into his arms, and held him, not tentatively, but with the contained tenderness of someone who has enormous strength and is holding it very carefully in check. Leaf's golden eyes, briefly open, found his father's face. Then he closed them again, satisfied. Aaron sat back down by the fire, the book closed in her lap, and did not try to pretend she wasn't feeling what she was feeling. It began as these things begin, without announcement. 3 mornings after the storm night, Erin woke in the room adjacent to the nursery with the distinct and slightly alarming sense that something in her chest had been rearranged. Not painfully. Not like illness. Like a lock that had been opened very quietly by someone who had found the key without looking for it. Her wolf, a gentle white-coated thing she had carried in her since childhood like a secret, was restless in a way she had no language for. She paced. She pressed her nose to the wind that came through the high window. She directed all her attention toward a point 3 walls and a corridor away, where the Alpha King's chambers were located, with the focused certainty of a compass needle. Erin sat up in her sleeping furs and pressed her hand flat to her sternum. Oh, she thought for the second time in this story. Oh no. She did not speak of it. She had no way to know if he felt it. The mate bond's awakening was not always simultaneous, was not always mutual in its timing, and there was every reason for the Alpha King to feel nothing of the kind for a 22-year-old Omega healer who had no political value and no bloodline claim to anything. She told herself this with great conviction, several times a day, with diminishing success. What she did notice, because she was, in the end, a healer and healers noticed things, was that Valdrick had developed a habit of finding reasons to be in whatever part of the stronghold she was in. He appeared in the nursery during hours he had not previously appeared. He passed through the healer's room to drop off reports for the archive when a servant could have carried them. Once, memorably, he appeared in the kitchen corridor at the 5th hour of the morning while she was warming milk for Sulka's night feed, and stood there for a full moment with no explanation offered, before saying that he had been checking the larder stocks, which Aaron was 90% certain was not true. She handed him the warm milk cup to hold while she adjusted the swaddling, and their hands touched at the transfer, and neither of them said anything, and the kitchen was very quiet. Runa, who had noticed everything, said one afternoon, "You realize you're both just waiting for the other one to speak first." "Nothing is happening," Aaron said. "Right," said Runa. "Nothing is happening at approximately 40 different moments a day. And both of you are very exhausted by how much nothing is happening." Aaron did not dignify this with a response. She also did not sleep particularly well that night. The message arrived in the 4th week of winter's deepest cold, carried by a merchant trader who had no visible awareness that the wax seal on the letter he delivered to Ironvale's gate was Sigrid's former house seal, cleverly altered. The letter contained a deposition, meticulously drafted, citing 7 witnesses from the servants' tier, alleging that Aaron Solvig had poisoned the royal nursemaid, had hidden the Alpha King's heirs as leverage, and had used mega manipulation craft to insinuate herself into the Alpha King's household for purposes of sedition. Elder Thyra brought the letter to Valdric herself. She watched his face as he read it, watched the precise moment when his expression went from reading neutral to the kind of controlled stillness that presaged violence. "Prepare the council hall," he said when he had finished. "Valdric," Thyra said quietly, "be careful." He looked at her. She met his gaze without flinching, which not everyone could do. "These witnesses were paid," he said. "I know, and you know. The council does not, yet, and Sigrid knew what she was doing when she wrote this. She knew that pack law requires a trial even when the charge is fabricated, and she knew," Thyra paused, "that asking you to sit in judgment of someone you cannot be objective about is the most effective trap she could have set." He looked at the letter again. His jaw was a hard line. "She also knew," Thyra continued, "that Aaron would refuse to compromise her own honor to make this easier, that she would stand before the council and answer the charges directly, and that there is a faction on the council who would vote to exile her on the grounds of rank alone, not because they believe the charges, but because an Omega holding the position she holds makes them uncomfortable." Valdric set the letter down on the table. Flat, precise. "Schedule the trial," he said, "and have Bram pull the gate records from the night in question." The council hall of Ironvale was built around a raised stone circle at its center. The bloodstone, a disk of dark granite worn smooth by centuries of pack law ceremonies, its surface marked by the handprints of every Alpha King who had ever stood upon it to render judgment. It was called the Bloodstone not because of any violence that had happened there, but because, under pack law, what was declared upon it was considered as binding as blood oath. Aaron stood in the center of it and did not let her hands shake. The 7 council members sat in the curved benches above. Bram stood to her left with the gate records. Thyra sat at the high end of the council arc with the expression of a woman who had seen many trials and had opinions about all of them. The charges were read. Aaron listened. When the reading was complete, she looked at the council members one by one, taking her time, and then she spoke. She told them exactly what she had seen in the eastern archway. She told them what Sigrid had said and what she had decided and why. She told them about the night in the servants' wing, about the yarrow mixture and the dropper feeding and the 3 hours of massage and the lullaby and the moment at 3 in the morning when life's eyes had opened for the first time. She did not use the language of grievance or politics. She used the language of medicine, of fact, of a healer describing a case. When she finished, the hall was entirely silent. One of the council members, Halfdan, the eldest of the group, a man who had served under Valdric's father, cleared his throat. "The gate records," he said to Bram. "Show us." The records showed Sigrid's vehicle departing the eastern gate at the 2nd hour after evening. The records showed Aaron's lamp logged through the outer yards at the same hour. The records showed the gate guard's note. Omega Healer carried 2 bundles from East Archway to North Tower. Assumed foundling animals. The date matched. Halfdan sat back. He looked at Valdric, who had been standing at the wall of the hall throughout, still his arms folded. "The witnesses," Halfdan said, "retract their testimony." It was not a question. He looked at the 6 people seated in the witness section. One by one they looked at the floor. Valdric stepped forward onto the bloodstone. He stopped beside Aaron, close enough that she could feel the heat of him in the cold hall air. He looked at the council and spoke a single sentence. "The charges are dismissed. The healer Aaron Solveig is declared a protected member of this household under my personal authority." He paused. "Any future attempt to bring fabricated charges against her will be treated as an attack on the Alpha's house and judged accordingly." The hall was silent. Then Halfdan placed his fist to his chest in the old gesture of pack acknowledgement. The other council members followed. Aaron stood very still on the bloodstone in the warmth of Valdric's proximity, and breathed. It was Thyra who came to Aaron's room that evening. She sat in the chair by the fire and folded her old hands in her lap and said without preamble, "The bond has been stirring since the storm night. You know this." Aaron sat on the edge of her sleeping pallet. "I know what I feel," she said carefully. "And what does he feel?" "I don't know what he—" "Aaron, Dot." Thyra's voice was gentle and completely final. "I have been reading pack bonds for 50 years. I watched the 2 of you in that council hall today, and I watched him on the feast night, and I watched him in the nursery, on the morning after he found the pups, and I'm telling you, as the elder of this pack, and as someone who has some investment in whether the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches lives the rest of his life in that particular variety of misery, that you know Aaron was quiet for a long time. "He hasn't said anything," she said finally. "Neither have you." Thyra rose, moved to the door, and paused. "He is standing in the corridor outside the nursery right now. He has been there for approximately 20 minutes. He's not checking on the pups." She offered a small, dry smile. "The pups are fine." She left. Aaron sat for another long moment. Then she stood, straightened her dress, and walked to the nursery. He was there, as Thyra had said, standing with his back to the wall across from the nursery door, not quite leaning, his arms crossed, his storm-gray eyes finding her the moment she stepped into the corridor. She stopped a few feet from him. The corridor was dim, the torchlight warm and irregular. "The council accepted the dismissal," she said. "Yes. Thank you. For the gate records." "Bram found them. I just presented them." A pause. Iron.he. His voice had dropped to the frequency he used only in the quiet spaces, the nursery, the healer's room, the kitchen at 5 in the morning. She had learned over weeks to distinguish this register of his voice from all his others, which was probably useful information and definitely dangerous information. "I have been trying," he said, and stopped. He seemed to be doing something difficult with language, which, given everything she knew about how he communicated, meant this was a moment of significant effort. "I have been trying to be the kind of man who does not ask you to remain in this house for the wrong reasons. The pups need you. The house needs you. Those are the right reasons." He looked at her directly. "But they are not all of my reasons, and I am aware that you know this, and I think it's past the point where honesty serves either of us less than silence." The corridor was very still. She took 2 steps toward him. The distance between them became the kind of distance that meant something, and they were both aware of it. Ask me, she said, quietly. The look that crossed his face then, she would spend a long time afterward attempting to describe it in accurate terms, and she would keep arriving at the same inadequate words. Undone. Open. Certain. He reached up and touched her face with one hand, his thumb resting along the line of her jaw with a care completely disproportionate to his strength, which was, she thought, precisely the point. Stay, he said. Not for the pups. For me. She turned her cheek into his palm, the way she would later think of as her answer, the moment before words. The mate bond, when it finally opened fully between them, felt like standing in a doorway of a warm room after a very long winter. He marked her that night, the old way, the formal way, with Elder Thyra present, and the words of the pack oath spoken over the hearth flame, above the collar of her dress, at the hollow where her neck met her shoulder, where the mark would be visible and where it would mean exactly what it was supposed to mean to every wolf in the northern reaches. His eyes, when he looked at her afterward, had gone fully gold. She thought she had never seen him look so entirely himself. Spring came slow to the northern reaches. It crept in by degrees, the frost line retreating up the hillside, the birch trees putting out their first tentative leaves, the days extending by minutes that accumulated, eventually into something that could be called warm. Leaf and Solka had become, in the months since winter, magnificently alive. They rolled across their sleeping furs with determination. They grabbed at anything within reach and examined it with the focused intensity of small scholars. Leaf had his father's directness. When he wanted something, he wanted it completely and immediately. Solka had a quality of quiet attention that reminded Erin, in a way that made her heart ache pleasantly, of watching someone she loved. Valdric had ridden north that morning to inspect a reported breach at the high border. A routine thing, the kind he dealt with several times a season. He had kissed Erin at the gate, his mouth warm against hers, his hand briefly at her waist. Before evening, he said, his promise. She was in the nursery with the pups when the power of the stronghold's main hearth fires went out. All of them at once, in the middle of the afternoon. The nursery plunged into the gray light of overcast spring sky. Iran set Solka down and went still, and her wolf, that quiet white creature, now considerably less quiet than she had been before the winter, lifted its head and read the air. Rotting roses. Metal. Old ambition curdled into something else. She had heard the smell described before she had ever encountered it. She would know it anywhere now. Hush, little heart, she whispered to Solka, laying her flat in the crib beside a stirring life, her hands gentle and her voice deliberately steady. Sleep, I'm here. She crossed to the nursery door. The guards outside were gone. Not the sounds of gone, the silence of gone. The door to the corridor opened from outside. Sigrid had been 6 months in exile, living on what remained of her political connections and her own formidable will, and the 6 months had taken a toll that her careful maintenance could no longer conceal. She was thin in the way that spoke of grievance consuming from within. Her hair, once her best feature, was roughly bound. Her eyes were the same, pale, level, absolutely certain of their own rightness. But the certainty had curdled into something that had stopped being rational some time ago. She held a blade, silver-edged, long. I want you to understand, she said, stepping into the nursery, that I don't enjoy this. Erin faced her squarely. She did not step away from the cribs. She did not reach for a weapon, because she had not been trained as a warrior, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. What she had instead was several months of carrying 2 infants, months of the healer's physical work, and the bone-deep knowledge, carried now in her blood, her wolf, her mate bond, of exactly what she was protecting. Leave, Erin said. Sigrid smiled, and it was a sad and broken thing to see. You took everything that was mine. The things that were yours, Aaron said, you chose to leave in a snowstorm. Something flickered in Sigrid's face. Then, with the speed of an alpha blood wolf, she moved. She was faster. She was stronger by birthright. She knew it, and she was counting on it. What she had not counted on was that Aaron had no interest in matching her strength. She had spent 6 months watching Valdric's war captains train in the yard below the healer's window, and she had noted, in the professional way a healer notes things, where the human body is most efficiently interrupted. She dropped. The blade cut across her upper arm, a searing line, silver burn. She noted it and set it aside. She came back up inside Sigrid's reach, too close for the blade to be useful, and drove the heel of her palm into the soft of Sigrid's nose, with everything she had. Sigrid staggered backward. Blood, blood. Shock, egg. The blade clattered against the stone floor. They stared at each other, both breathing hard. Aaron bent, picked up the blade, and straightened. Her arm was burning. She did not look at it. I am not what I was when you left them in the snow, Aaron said. Her voice was completely level. I have a pack now. I have a mate. I have those children, who are not weak and were never weak. They were just inconvenient to you, and there is a difference. She held Sigrid's gaze without flinching. You can come at me every season for the rest of your life, Sigrid. What I have now, you will never touch. The nursery doors came off their hinges with a sound like a thunderclap. Valdric stood in the ruins of the doorway, and behind him were 4 of his war captains, and behind them the corridor was in considerable disarray, and he had clearly ridden very fast from wherever he had been. He was breathing hard. His eyes swept the room. The pups in their cribs, awake and crying but unharmed, the blade in Aaron's hand, the blood on Aaron's arm, Sigrid backed against the far wall with her hands raised. His gaze returned to Aaron. His chest moved in a long breath. She had seen him by this point in many registers. The commander, the king, the father, the man at 5 in the morning in a kitchen. She had never seen him look at her the way he looked at her now, as though she was both the thing he had been afraid to lose and the thing that had just proven it could not be lost. And those 2 things together were almost more than could be contained. The bond, he said, which was not an explanation, but was the only word that covered it. He had felt her through it, felt the spike of silver burn and the rising ferocity of her omega wolf, felt her choose to stand instead of run, and he had made 12 kilometers in what was not a reasonable time even for an alpha. I'm fine, she said. Her arm was not entirely fine, but it would be. He crossed to her in 3 strides and took her face in both his hands, tilting her head up, checking her with the comprehensive urgency of someone who needed to verify with their own senses what they already knew. His thumbs brushed her cheekbones. His eyes were still gold from the run. I had it, she told him. I know, he said. His voice was not entirely steady. I felt you. Behind them, Bram had entered the room and was removing Sigrid with the professional efficiency of a man who had been waiting a long time to do exactly that. In their cribs, Leif and Solka had been soothed by the presence of both their parents in the room, and had returned, with the pragmatic self-interest of the very young, to a state of active curiosity about the world. Iron leaned her forehead against Valdric's chin, felt his arms close around her, carefully, accounting for the wound on her arm. Felt the pack bond between them hum with something she would have called relief if it hadn't contained so much more than that. You promised before evening, she said. I was early, he said, and she felt the rumble of it in his chest against her cheek. Not quite a laugh, but everything a laugh contains. The Garden of Ironvale, in early summer, was nothing like the rest of the stronghold. The rest of the stronghold was stone and function and centuries of purpose. The garden was something someone had once permitted to become wild, and it had taken the permission very seriously. Roses climbed the south wall in a cheerful disregard for order. The apple trees had spread their canopies into each other's space decades ago and now existed as a single interconnected canopy, which the pack's children considered an ideal arrangement. Leaf and Solka, 14 months old and in full possession of opinions about everything, were currently pursuing a butterfly across the grass with the focused determination of small hunters who had not yet connected the gap between intention and coordination. Irene sat on the blanket in the summer light and watched them and felt the specific quality of happiness that has survived being tested and has decided to stay anyway. Valdric dropped down beside her without announcement, shedding his outer vest and settling with his back against the old apple tree, pulling her gently into the curve of his side. She went easily, in the way of two people who have learned each other's geometry. His hand rested against her waist, warm through the linen of her dress. His chin found the top of her head. "Leaf is going to fall," he observed. "He'll get up," she said. "You never worry." "I always worry. I just don't perform it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "They're going to be extraordinary." She watched Solka abandon the butterfly project and sit down very deliberately in the middle of the grass, examining a stem of clover with concentrated attention. Then Leaf fell down, exactly as predicted, sat up, looked at the butterfly that had escaped him, and immediately redirected his attention to the clover his sister was examining. "They already are," Aaron said. Valdric turned his head to press a kiss to her hair, slow and unhurried. The way he kissed her when there was no urgency, and he wanted her to know there was no urgency, when he was simply choosing, again, with full attention, the thing he had chosen before. She turned her face up to his, and he met her, the way the summer light met the garden, inevitable, warm, unashamed. Between them, something that had begun in a blizzard at the frozen eastern gate, a sound so thin it had almost been missed, a decision made in the dark, had become this: two children chasing light through a summer garden, and two people who had found in each other the answer to a question neither had known they were asking. The Omega who had lived in the margins had not simply saved the pups. She had walked into the center of things, and in doing so had become the center. And the king, who had been built of stone and discipline and careful distance, had opened, slowly, in the warmth of a small hearth, a healer's careful hands, a voice reading old mythology in the dark, and had become at last someone capable of receiving what was being offered. That, Elder Thyra would say later, when the story had become one of the ones people told, that is what the old sagas meant by Hevitamar. Not magic, not power, the particular, undestroyable will to give warmth when the world asks you to freeze. The truest measure of strength is not found in dominion, in fang, or in bloodlines hammered from war. It is found in the quiet, luminous courage to shield the vulnerable when the cost is everything, and in the grace to let yourself be held in return. What this story leaves behind. There is a moment in this story that I keep returning to. Not the trial, not the final confrontation, though both of those are the kind of scenes that stay in the chest for days. The moment I keep returning to is smaller than either of those. It is a girl, alone in a basement room in the middle of a blizzard, sitting on a narrow cot with two dying infants pressed against her bare skin, humming a lullaby that no one else will ever hear. No one sent her there. No one asked her to stay. No one would have blamed her for walking away. She had no rank, no protection, no guarantee that what she was doing would not cost her everything. She stayed anyway. That is the entire story, really. Everything else, the king, the bond, the council trial, the final storm, all of it is the world catching up to a decision that was made in the dark by someone with nothing to gain and no audience to witness it. We live in a world that has a complicated relationship with quiet acts. We are very good at celebrating the dramatic ones, the speeches, the confrontations, the moments that are visible and nameable and easy to point to. What we are less practiced at is recognizing the acts that happen before anyone is watching. The decision to turn toward something when every reasonable instinct says it is not your problem. The choice to spend your warmth on someone else's emergency. The willingness to hold a fragile thing carefully through the whole long night, even when your arms are tired and the outcome is not guaranteed. Erin did not save those children because she was brave in any conventional sense of the word. She saved them because she could not imagine doing otherwise, and that is a different and more durable kind of bravery than the kind that requires an audience. What this story asks, I think, is not whether you are capable of the grand gesture. Most of us are, under the right circumstances, with the right stakes and the right amount of adrenaline. What it asks is whether you are capable of the small one, the one at 3 a.m. when no one will ever know, the one that costs you sleep or comfort or the safety of keeping your head down, the one where the only witness is the person you will have to be tomorrow, looking back. Valdric is a king built of iron and distance, and the thing that opens him is not power meeting power. It is gentleness meeting his. It is watching someone choose, again and again, without drama or demand, to give warmth to the things in his life that needed it most. He had spent a long time believing that to need something was to be weakened by it. He had to watch someone who needed very little choose to give everything before he could understand that need and strength are not opposite. That receiving care does not diminish you. That a king who cannot be held is not unbreakable. He is simply alone. There is something the old sagas called Havitamar, the white heart wolves, the ones through whom the pack's warmth ran. They were not the strongest. They were not the fastest or the most politically useful. They were, in the language of the stories, the ones who remembered that the point of the pack was not territory or hierarchy or bloodline. The point was that no one froze alone. Erin is that. And the world is full of people like her. People who are quietly, consistently, remarkably generous in ways the room never quite registers. People who show up. People who stay. People who ask nothing and give the thing that was needed before you knew you needed it. People who hold the fragile things carefully without being asked through the whole long night. If you know someone like that, tell them. Not tomorrow. Now. And if you are someone like that, if you are the person who stays, the one who turns toward, the one who has given warmth in the dark, with no guarantee of return, then this story is for you. This story is a reminder that what you do is seen, even when no one says so. That it matters, even when the world moves past it without acknowledgement. That the things you do in the quiet, in the cold, in the moments before anyone is watching, those are the things that change the story. Sigrid had the ring. She had the bloodline. She had the title and the access and every structural advantage the world could offer. And she left. Erin had nothing but the decision to stay. The story belongs to the one who stayed. If something in this story hit differently for you, drop it in the comments. Tell us which moment stayed with you, or share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Stories like this one only keep going because of the people who carry them forward. If you want more, subscribe and come find us in the next one. We will be here. Thank you truly for watching until the end.